It's gone through a process that is very like the process that fast food went through in the 50s and 60s, in the process of optimizing a product which isn't just a bunch of hamburgers and fried chicken. But with our political system, I regard it as essentially uninhabitable. There's nothing authentic going on. Everyone's acting, everything's optimized for effect. So how are you going to get people's attention on Twitter? You're pushed back into the fast foodified channel. You've got to come up with the communications equivalent of salt, sugar, or fat. That would take you a while to get into. And we don't have a while. We just have the endless bombardment, the endless fast foodification of our culture. Welcome to Paying Attention with me, Nicholas Gruen, and my friend Peyton Bowman. I have my trusty glass of green tea here, and now over to Peyton to introduce the topic.
Hi, Nicholas. Yes, today's topic is fast foodification. So, Nicholas, I've heard you use this term. I believe you may have even coined it. What does it mean? What do you mean by this term?
So I cooked this term up when I was thinking about politics, and it seemed to me that politics, and I think quite a lot about, when I use the word, people know very quickly what I mean. And when I talk about politics and when I say politics is fast foodified, people cotton on to what I mean usually, which is that it's optimized, that it's it's gone through a process that is very like the process that fast food went through in the 50s and 60s, in the process of optimizing a product which isn't just a bunch of hamburgers and fried chicken, but, you know, a whole operation of advertising, the way you design a shop and so on. And it's all designed around the idea of instant gratification, of instantly cutting through, getting people to notice, and then getting them to do what you want, which in the case of fast food is to buy fast food. And that's essentially what's happened, I think, very generally in our culture. So that, I think, is a great way to make a sort of shortcut to start talking about what's happened to aspects of our culture, not least our politics.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it sounds pretty bad. I will say that just off the top, but it does sound like there's some good to it, right? Like there's some optimization that's going on there. What is good about it and what is bad about it?
So Adam Smith is the most famous comment, or the most famous, is it a single sentence or two sentences, of Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, writing a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And he's trying to tell people that markets aren't scary things, that used well, they can really help us get lots of what we need and what we want. And so he writes, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity. We don't ask them for a favour, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages." So a market is a place in which these two needs of the buyer and the seller are brought into accommodation. And it's, you know, I don't want to, well, unfortunately, when people say this is a beautiful thing, it makes them sound like they're somebody who says, therefore, we should solve all problems with markets, or markets are always great, which is not what I'm saying at all. But markets are miraculous where they work well. Because imagine, I mean, this whole business, notice that he doesn't say self-interest is good. He says one person's self-interest is brought into a relation with another's self-interest, and those two things are jointly improved. Everybody's interests, as judged by them, and that's the trick, are improved. Now, of course, if the butcher can sell you a cut and call a rump steak fillet steak, which is more expensive, the butcher will make more money. But they'll make more money in the short term, because fairly quickly you'll probably figure out that this butcher tries to trick you, and there are other butchers that you can go and see. And that shows you how a market works, but how a market might not work. And the thing about fast food is that fast food is very good food. It's clean. It's got quite a lot of nutrition, often. I'm thinking of something like a McDonald's hamburger. But we've just turned up the dial a bit, because it turns out that when we were hunter-gatherers, things that turned up with a lot of fat, with a lot of sugar and a lot of salt, all of those things told our primitive brains that this was a good thing to eat. And as encountered in nature, these things are signals of good food. But when they're optimized by fast food merchants, we turn up the dial too far. And if we can get people continuing to eat that food, it turns into a kind of poison. So it's a subtle business. It's a subtle non-alignment between a buyer and a seller. Not a very pronounced non-alignment. They're not selling you anything that's going to kill you quickly. And a lot of people who could be selling hamburgers. I mean, I would imagine that the people who came up with this system in the 1950s, who optimized it, they probably didn't think they were doing anything wrong at all. They didn't know that that getting you hooked on this diet was going to be bad for you. So these are quite subtle things, and they're subject to this juggernaut of optimization. And that's what's happened to our politics. And whereas I, have a Macca's, I have a McDonald's hamburger once in a blue moon, and I quite like it, and it certainly doesn't poison me. I don't. It's a kind of it's not a disastrous part of our food supply, but it's got some issues with it. With our political system, I regard it as essentially uninhabitable. There's nothing authentic going on. Everyone's acting. Everything's optimized for effect, and this is just destroying. Everything is mediated. Everyone's got their cameras out, trying to present their opponents in a bad light or in a sensational light. And we all know that we could do this to each other forever. That's what we're doing right now. And it's doing immense damage to our politics.
So it's a little bit different from, just to back up a little bit, a gap between, say, something you need, something that's good for you, and something that you want that's not necessarily destructive. It's more like there have been certain things that have been optimized to a point, good things, and because we're so attracted to these particular things, we're sort of unable to, keep the balance or hold on to maybe some other goods that we want later on. Like for example, if you eat a hamburger once every couple of weeks, that should be no problem. But then if we just every day we kind of get home from work and we say, oh, what I really want is a cheeseburger, and from McDonald's, and so this slowly means I've sort of forgotten the kind of broader perspective on, my diet or something, or how to keep myself healthy or something good, right? And so I think there's a sense in which there is this this focus on this immediate good versus that sort of, broader, deeper good.
So think about, so let's say you and I know that mass incarceration in the United States is bad for almost everybody. It's bad. It's certainly bad. It looks pretty bad for the people who get incarcerated. It's bad for their families. It's bad for the people they harmed, not immediately, but there are going to be more people who do that. In other words, there are other societies. It's incredibly bad for the government's budget, so it costs everybody money. And every society other than the United States has a prison population 1/10, something like 1/10 of the United States prison population. So let's say all those things are true. And let's say, well, we live in a democracy. You're an American citizen living in Japan. I'm in Australia. But we'll go with two Americans in America right now. And they say, well, we just need to let people know. And so you try and get on TV. Well, how are you going to get on TV? You need to get on a media. You need to tell people through me first. Well, you get on Twitter. So how are you going to get people's attention on Twitter? You're pushed back into the foodified channel. You've got to come up with the communications equivalent of salt, sugar, or fat. And it turns out that once you're in that realm of instant sound bites, when you've got to that low on the brainstem, it's easy to sell the idea of retribution. It's easier to have a horrible story about someone doing something horrible and then say, do we believe in good and evil? Do we believe in punishing bad people? And the answer is yes, you can believe that you can get beyond mass incarceration without letting all the prisoners out and saying we don't have a policing system anymore. But the way in which but it's much harder to communicate one political message than the other political message. And there you go. That's why it's hard to get highly nutritious fast food, because fast food isn't optimized for high levels of nutrition.
So this seems to be a pretty big problem for democracy and for our political system. Does it have any impact on our kind of wider?
Yeah, I have a slide which when I'm presenting on these things, I basically argue that that our whole culture is that this describes our whole culture to a very substantial extent. So. And many people say, oh, well, that's the impact of the internet. Now, it isn't the impact of the internet. The internet has made a lot of this stuff worse. If you want to cut through on social media, all the nobodies or the people who aren't already famous trying to get some attention on social media, they cut things down even more, that they try and, get through to us with even simpler messages. But before that, my sort of go-to fact, which I must have shared with you before, is that presidential sound bites on network news in the United States fell from 48 seconds. Just think of watching a sound bite for 48 seconds. It's unheard of. And that was what was going on in 1968. And 20 years later in 1988, before the internet had any impact, it was 9 seconds. So this is communications. If you want to communicate, it doesn't have to be about politics. If you want to tell people you've got a great product, you've got 9 seconds. Whose products are going to survive better in that environment? So that's food, media, advertising is the same sort of story. I would say, I think it's one of the reasons why sport is so ubiquitous, is just constantly on our TVs, because you can park yourself for 2 or 3 minutes in front of the TV, get a bit of entertainment, you kind of understand what's going on, or it might be a highlights reel, and you are just endlessly watching something that's easily understood and kind of satisfying in the same way that fast food is, in an unsatisfying kind of way. So that's one, and then there are lots of areas. And then, yes, things have got worse in other areas of our culture since the internet. So, porn is a good example. So porn is kind of sexual. It's sort of sexuality fast foodified in some kind of way. That's become much more prevalent in our internet-based world, and and social media, of course, has cranked all this stuff up. But fake news is something which, in the degree of its weaponization, has now there's plenty of it about, and it's very difficult to I'll basically say that I'll just assert that Donald Trump is more responsible for spinning fake news stories than his opponents. And how would you ever explain that on a media where everyone can shout and everyone can tweet and everyone can go and get, records of Hillary's emails or Hunter Biden's laptop or whatever, and then say everyone does this. And of course, everyone does do it to some extent, but some people do it more than others. Well, that's a subtle message that would take you a while to get into. And we don't have a while. We just have the endless bombardment, the endless fast foodification of our culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about all the implications of this. You mentioned this soundbite time, and I remember too, this is a little bit of an aside because I'm not sure how it affects the outcomes of politics, but I remember Donald Trump, this was before he was president, criticizing Daniel Day-Lewis's portrayal of Lincoln because he thought he spoke too slowly, right? Trump said, if you want to get things done, you have to speak faster. And I don't know, maybe there's some way
I guess maybe, I suppose there would be primary sources telling us whether Lincoln had a reputation for speaking slowly. Reading his speeches, I can think that he would have spoken them somewhat slowly because they have a quality which might be better if they're a little slowed down. Who knows? But there you are. That's Donald Trump telling us what our current values are for communicating, and he's a great communicator. If you regard the efficacy, if you regard his ability to attract headlines and attract attention, that's what we call a great communicator. He's a great liar as well. He's giving us a kind of mainline access to a giant subconscious rage. Turns out people find that entertaining. And that's what we now call a great communicator. So that's a kind of, a vector of a pretty powerful vector of fake news right there.
Yeah. Well, at another point, you spoke to me a bit about, you would have called something like this satisfying a primary preference as opposed to a secondary preference. So where we're trying to give people something they want like immediately. So, but what is the difference between those two? What's a primary preference and a secondary preference? And how does it connect to this idea of giving people what they want?
So I don't much like the terms. They're rather bloodless, but anyway, that's okay. That's science for you. But modern psychology distinguishes between primary preferences and secondary preferences, and primary preference. So one way, probably the best way to put it is that a primary preference is what you want, and a secondary preference is what you want to want. And if you go to an AA meeting, you will meet a whole lot of people, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, you'll meet a whole lot of people who want alcohol, but they want to not want alcohol. So their secondary preference and their primary preference are not aligned. And we're in a society which will market relentlessly to those primary preferences. And it won't really give anyone any help to develop these wants that they want. But most people over a certain age, maybe people under that age, maybe it's a kind of almost, maybe you've learnt some of this idea by the time you're learning to talk. But I think certainly in my own case, I can just give you a very simple example. It relates to the fast food story in a way. When I was not sure when I was about 17 or 18, I had milk and sugar in my tea, and I sort of I don't know whether I wanted to want them without those things, but I sort of, let's say that I did, and I thought maybe, there's an issue, is tea Is tea with is the sugar good for you? Certainly, you can have, if you have a 0-calorie drink, that's kind of a nice thing to be able to do. So I didn't think, oh, good, I'm going to climb the mountain. I'm just going to go through my life sipping on this tea here. Cheers. And sort of not liking it very much. I didn't take sugar or milk for about 3 weeks. And I would have rathered the sugar and the milk for all of those 3 weeks. And at the end of those 3 weeks, when I put sugar or milk back in the tea, I didn't like it. So I had simply my primary and my secondary. So here I was just wandering along having tea with milk and sugar. That's all happy, no problem. At some stage, something occurs to me, be kind of better if I didn't like either of the, if I had tea without sugar. I know what I'll do. I'll just sort of try this. All very easy, all very gentle. 3 weeks of the mildest kind of effort and habit formation, and all of a sudden, and then my primary preferences line up with my secondary preferences. I think that's a very simple model of many aspects of our life, and it's sort of part of maturing. It's part of leading a life that you want to lead, and I would say that culture helped us do that. That our parents helped us do that. There are a whole range of forces in our life that help us do that, and capitalism, the market, doesn't help us do that. It's trying to tap in to those primary preferences because that's how to sell stuff.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to explore a little bit about how the role that competition plays in this primary and secondary preference kind of competition, let's say. But before we get into that, I mean, I want to dig in a little bit more to this, because we spoke a little bit about a kind of psychological element. So, the way in which we experience sort of pleasures or goods within our mind. And, you spoke a little bit about how primary preferences kind of inhabit that space, or how they grow into that space.
Yeah. So I've recently, and I'm no expert, and you might have to help me out here, Peyton, but I recently was in email communication with a philosopher who, or a theologian, I think he was, and I grabbed a very simple sentence out of a speech that he gave, and it was about virtue and the law. And the simple sentence is this: I think I can quote it exactly. I love it. It says, "Vice always comes disguised as virtue, no exceptions." And insofar as McDonald's sells vice-laden food, and as I've already said, it's very good food, but they've just turned the dial a bit towards food that's not good for us. That's something that is disguised as virtuous, or disguised as something we like, is something we like, but comes with a sting in the tail over a long period of time. And so I was in email communication with this guy. His name's Ryan Mead, and I said, where do you get this from? Because I love that, what you just said there. And he said, well, I still have to pin him down on this more, but he wrote back rather quickly because he'd been ill and so on. And he said, with apologies to Aristotle and Aquinas and their notion of the apparent good. So now so I've done some reading on Aristotle's notion of the apparent good, and I like this idea. So Aristotle is one of these people who, again, does not teach that the good is this thing that we hate to do, but God tells us to do it. So it's a kind of agonizing thing to do. We kind of put our hands up when the Nazis turn up and we say, take me, don't take that person there, or we do something heroic. And so in that sort of model of morality, which I think is well and alive and good in the academy in many ways, it's a kind of utterly selfless idea of morality. And I don't think that makes any sense. Certainly, we can observe people's behaviour. You can measure how utterly selfless people are. And one way to do it is to ask how much they give to charity. And they give about 1% of their income to charity. That's how utterly selfless people are. So Aristotle's idea is a very different one. Aristotle's idea is that the apparent good is a thing that's telling us that a thing is good. It's motivating us to participate in it. So let's stick with the fast food metaphor. We see the hamburger, we see the Kentucky Fried Chicken with its utterly finger-licking good recipe dripping with too much oil and leaving you feeling a bit ghastly afterwards. And we think that, and it is the apparent good. And that brings us into doing something good. And then our secondary preferences start, or as our character develops and we acquire virtue, our more virtuous nature says, well, hang on, it's good. We like it immediately, but we keep noticing after we've eaten it that it's actually not that good. And so Aristotle's notion of the apparent good, as I understand it, is a notion in which the apparent good motivates us. Good motivates us. When we see good, we try to do it, generally speaking. And our virtues, the way in which we school ourselves to habitually choose something better rather than something worse, brings about this transformation between the primary and secondary, brings about greater alignment between secondary and primary preferences. And we start saying, look, I won't go to KFC. It's really too fatty, but I will go to Subway or whatever. And so we start to so notice the difference here. Our conquering of will in our lives, our doing of good, our gradually trying to align our lives with the good, is not some self-sacrificing, heroic struggle. It is simply us tutoring ourselves to prefer something that's a bit better to something that's a bit worse as we learn to school our primary preferences and move them more towards the good. And so I like that. I think that's for me, that's a very attractive psychology of ethics, if you like, much less heroic than the things that we're normally brought up with.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like, it's a sense of discipline or culture in a way. I think you mentioned earlier culture as a way of helping us inform those preferences and gradually point our primary preferences towards the secondary.
Yeah. And gradually.
So, for example,
and acquire new secondary preferences. I can tell you, I'm not actively schooling myself very well in this right now, but I mean, most of us feel that we would like to be able to concentrate better in this world of the internet, and we are constantly tempted not to. And so that's an example of some secondary preferences that I'm not doing that well on. And we adopt strategies. We constrain ourselves. We program our smartphones to only be able to look at our email a few times a day, or in my case, I don't look at my email. I do look at my emails. I won't take you into the elaborate story, but generally, I don't clear all my emails and make sure they're all done until until the evening. So that's a routine that I've developed, and our lives are like this. We try and develop habits that are more aligned with our longer term needs and desires as human beings, not our infantile desires of I want to do this and I want to do it immediately.
Well, I think I want to talk a little bit about this process. I think there's two steps to this process, right? So you can think about the initial step as, let's say, Odysseus encountering the sirens, right? So he knows he's going to encounter this like completely like enchanting sound that is unbelievably appealing, completely overwhelming. He's aware of the effect that this will have on him because of culture in a way, because someone somehow
and he knows that there's
the
bones of sailors through the Isle of whatever, you'll be able to correct me the term, but it's the Isle of the Sirens or something. Isn't that what it's called? Something like that. Anyway.
Well, I think I visited it. It was like on Capri, supposedly.
On Capri, but anyway, outside Naples. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the claim anyway. Capri or Sorrento, somewhere around there. Anyway, so there's this almost heroic way in which he restrains himself, and I think that is something our culture gets really caught up on, which is, we imagine someone who's decided they're going to lose weight, so they stop eating all the bad food and they start exercising every day and they run 10 miles. And there's something heroic about this. Odysseus ties himself down to his boat.
Well, but let me interrupt. It's heroic in a sense, but it's a heroism before the event, and a knowledge that one will not be a hero when one needs to be a hero. So that's the beauty of the tale.
Yeah, and it's obviously not very sustainable either.
Yeah.
So then what you talked about a little bit earlier was something like it was almost schooling the primary preferences. So initially you liked to have your tea with sugar, and then at the end of that process, your primary preference had changed because you tasted that. And everyone, I think, has gone through this process. When you're young and you're a child, you don't like drinking things like beer or coffee things like this, but you develop tastes for these things by sort of training that primary preference. So I think that raises a couple interesting questions. So we certainly have seen that primary preferences are, let's say, overrepresented in the marketplace.
Yes, because they're so easy to sell into. That's why. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, do you think that, and, this is a bit of an offshoot of our conversation, but do you think that the market also works to train primary preferences?
Look at McDonald's. And look at obesity in the United States. Yes, I do. I absolutely do. Firstly, those primary preferences are the ones that are marketed to, and so you've got a double effect. You've got the secondary preferences are not cultivated. Nothing like the amount of money goes. Some money goes into that. So most countries around the world have funded bodies through their governments to promote quitting smoking, for instance. So there are some, but you compare that and now that's a rather exceptional case because we've also starting to ramp up the prohibitions on smoking. But if you look at tobacco, if you look at gambling, vastly more effort goes in. Let's take both of those. So, did I say tobacco? I mean alcohol. If I said I mean alcohol and gambling. If I didn't say alcohol, now, alcohol's a slightly different case, but certainly gambling, I think, is a paradigm of primary preferences. And large amounts of money, large amounts of resources are devoted to getting to stoking those primary preferences, and tiny amounts of money are spent advertising, trying to help people not gamble if it isn't doing them any good. I think this is quite across the board. And again, as I was saying in politics, it's exactly the same thing. Secondary political skills, the skill of being able to listen to the other side, the skill of being able to compromise with the other side. These are basically in the crosshairs of our political system. I mean, everyone talks, everyone says, why can't we have more of it? And the reason is because you can't get anywhere with more of it. You won't get on the television. You won't. No one will have heard of you, and so you're tipped endlessly into the infantile primary preferences. And this is just tremendously important. And our culture is. Our culture isn't very supportive either. So I wrote down, just as we were talking a couple of minutes ago, Jane Austen. What are the novels of Jane Austen about? They're sort of about secondary preferences. They're about women who get tempted by men who look good, sound good, and are up to no good, and make their lives a misery, and women who kind of have the insight or suffer through a process of learning to eventually work out that vice is always disguised as virtue, and to start sorting out what virtue and vice is, start realizing that they will be happier with a virtuous man. Their lives will be happier if they stick to the straight and narrow of a good, respectable middle-class existence. Now, we're all a bit cynical about that, and we like to think that there are other kinds of existence. But that represents a culture which is coming in on the side of secondary preferences. A culture that says when you're born, you're a little bundle of ego needs, ego desires, and the role of your parents and the role of the culture is to strengthen your ability to choose preferences that you can honestly say have been chosen by you and are not just your untutored desires.
Yeah. So it's really a matter of, in terms of stoking all of this, it's because it's a big competition. Is that why the market? Of course, the market is competitive.
Yeah, if you're in an I mean, all of these systems we've talked about, markets, but also lots of people have talked about electoral politics as a market for votes, which is what it is.
Yeah.
But you don't even have to call it a market for votes. Basically, this is a highly articulated field in which people are optimizing outcomes for them, not for you, but for them. And so if you're a political operative, if you're polling, if you're writing a speech, if you're writing the speech, you're saying, how do I get a soundbite from this speech on the news? If you're polling, or let's say you're running a focus group, you don't, if people say, let's say, in Australia a couple of decades ago in a focus group, what had happened was we'd gone through a savage recession in the early 1990s. We were coming out of it, and then interest rates went up. And in a focus group, somebody said we've had 5 minutes of economic sunshine. Well, the opposition leader of the time got that phrase and thrashed it for all it was worth. So the people doing the focus group are harvesting it. They're not there to help anyone in the focus group. They're not there to really understand the dilemmas, because the thing is that, of course, as an economy recovers, it's likely that interest rates will rise. They're just there. They're just extracting what they can to do as well as they can. And if they don't do that, there's another team that is doing that, and they'll win the election. So this is a competitive environment, and such environments are likely to produce this powerful drive towards our infantile preferences, our primary preferences, just like fast food. And so it's one of the things that I've been trying to think about is how do you come up, what modest, not revolutionary, but what modest changes might be possible. Remember, like Aristotle, I'm just trying to move the dial a bit, what modest changes might unpick this? And so that seems to me to be a really worthwhile question to ask.
So yeah, not a question of getting rid of competition, but maybe bringing it back from this brink of hyper competition.
Yes, but there are
this,
things but you can have, as I'm now fond of saying, democracy I think of as a three-legged stool. One leg is direct democracy, and in Athens that was the assembly, and the assembly voted. In our system, it is everybody voting. In America every 3 years, in Australia roughly every 3 years. So that's direct democracy. Then there are two legs, each of which create representation of the people, and the one we're fixated on is what I call competitive representation, which is by elections. We just say everyone gets a chance to vote, and we'll let anyone compete for those votes. And look at where we are. It kind of worked for a while, and it's good. It's better than Soviet Russia, but it's got some problems. And then this other way to represent the people is representation by sampling, which is what we do in a jury. We say we're going to get ordinary people. We'll randomly select them, and then we'll stick 12 of them on this body, and they'll make up their minds whether they think Amber Heard or Johnny Depp is telling the truth. And probably both of them are having a bit of a lend of us. So look at that. That's not competitive. Yeah. No one is sitting there thinking, well, if I don't come up with an answer that pleases people, I'm going to lose my job. Other people will replace me. So it's a very different institution, and I call it a decompetitive institution. And one of the things about what happens in a jury is that a jury creates its own culture. And that culture, I'm not going to tell you that in the period of a trial that it will produce a big swing towards secondary preferences, but it does develop an inhabitable culture in which people's better nature can be appealed to in a way that is increasingly difficult in competitive democracy. We've talked on other occasions about ways we can actually select for merit without competition. And I'll take you through that quickly, which is in a very large citizen jury in Adelaide with 340 people. They needed spokespeople. How did they pick them? They needed about 10 or 15 spokespeople. How did they pick them? They picked 15 people at random. They said, let's go into a room. We'll spend 2 hours. The first hour is working out criteria according to which one would decide if someone was a good or a not so good spokesperson. In other words, criteria of merit. The next hour is spent talking about who we've met who meet those criteria. That's not a competitive system. That does not create incentives for people to compete with each other, or to the extent that it does. Well, firstly, they don't know the criteria. But if you were to try to anticipate that process and get selected, you would behave rather differently than someone who's in an election, who's trying to get their name out, who's trying to make a big splash. Rather, you would be much more likely to try to see other people's point of view, to try to be a good contributor to a discussion. So that's a way in which you dial down the competition and you start to see a move, this is my argument, from from an institution that isn't just a juggernaut reinforcing primary preferences into an institution which is creating is creating an environment in which those secondary preferences can be honoured and cultivated.
Yeah, at least they would have a shot, as opposed to
exactly,
right?
Exactly. I mean, I think we can think of them as quite fragile in some ways. They're not sort of lowest common denominator things, but it gives them a chance. And in the current system, that they're a chance as a sort of a boutique. You know, some people will subscribe to the New Yorker or something like that, but most people will subscribe to their tabloid newspaper if they're into that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's interesting too to think about how these juries have a kind of, as you say, their own culture
Yeah,
too. And
I think that's
because we
incredibly
spoke a
important.
little bit about
Sorry, go on.
how culture can condition the primary
That's
preferences,
right. That's
in the
right.
same way that competition can, and give you a shot of getting people to think a little bit differently, even at
Yeah,
a
that's right.
basic
That's
level.
right. I think that's and I don't think we can think. I mean, I think we massively underestimate the extent to which the culture that we live in influences, what we think, how we relate to each other, and so, and one another way to think about contemporary political culture is that it's whatever can survive in a kind of an uninhabitable culture. If you're interested in something and you have to go on the telly and talk about it, you kind of go and get lots of training to to communicate in a kind of false kind of way, to get to your talking points quickly, not to say to someone who's trying to play gotcha with you, not to say to somebody who's asking you hostile questions, well, that's a good question. And I don't think, and I think that is a problem with my position on, however, this is why I still think the way I do. You'll be told by a media trainer that's not the way to handle a media interview. And so, and so, but if we kill that, we essentially kill the capacity for deliberation and for the development of quality in our thinking.
Well, very interesting. Well, I think that I look forward to thinking a bit about how we could all do better with these institutions. I mean, do you have any final thoughts on any other ways in which we could do better in terms of improving our kind of our ability to follow secondary preferences over primary preferences, and to condition our primary preferences so that they follow our secondary preferences?
I think I'll sort of repeat what I said, but make it more general, which is that I think respecting, rewarding, honouring merit, excellence, is incredibly important, and not something which we talk about much in our culture, in our politics, but understanding that in most areas of importance to us, politics is an example, culture is another, pure competition will create a capacity for all kinds of things to go wrong in the selection of merit. And so we have to look for, we definitely have to look for ways of selecting for merit, but we have to be aware of how hyper competition is likely to poison that process.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Nicholas. It's been great
Thanks,
speaking
mate.
to you.